March 7th, 1945. Remagen, Germany. The Rhine River shimmered beneath a grey dawn, wide and cold as iron. Mist hung low over the valley, veiling the ruins of a town pounded flat by artillery. From the western bank, soldiers of the US 9th and 7th Armoured Division stared across the water at a miracle, a bridge still standing. Captain Karl Timmerman squinted through his field glasses. The Ludendorff Bridge, a steel truss colossus, stretched across the river like a ghost from another age. Jesus, he whispered. They forgot to blow it. The Germans had destroyed nearly every bridge over the Rhine to stop the Allies from crossing. But somehow, this one remained. On the far side, German demolition teams scrambled under frantic orders. Explosives had been set, but the fuses were damp, the circuits erratic. A young sapper, his uniform blackened with soot, screamed, "Es zündet nicht! It won't ignite!" Seconds later, a thunderclap. A partial detonation tore a hole in the structure, but the bridge still stood, shuddering, wounded but alive. Timmerman didn't hesitate. "We're taking it," he barked to his men. Within minutes, infantry of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion began their dash across the open span. Bullets hissed through the fog, chipping steel beams, ricocheting off helmets. Sergeant Alex Drabick led the charge, sprinting under fire, his boots slapping the metal decking. "Let's go, boys," he shouted, "before they change their damn minds." On the opposite bank, German machine guns barked. Mortars exploded in the shallows. But the Americans kept coming, one by one, squad after squad, until they had seized the eastern end of the bridge. For the first time since the invasion of France, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. News of the feat spread like wildfire through the ranks. For weeks, Allied engineers had struggled to keep pace with retreating Germans, who blew bridges faster than they could be rebuilt. But here, at Remagen, everything changed. By nightfall, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion rolled in, grim, mud-streaked, and ready for the impossible. Their orders: reinforce the bridge, build another, and keep the road open for tanks. The Rhine was now the last great barrier to Hitler's heartland, and the Americans intended to cross it, no matter how many times the enemy tried to bring the span down. As the sun vanished beyond the smoke-choked horizon, German artillery began its revenge. Shells whistled across the river, smashing into the piers. The ground shook. Sparks rained down. An engineer captain shouted over the roar, "Keep the damn planks coming! We lose this bridge, we lose the war!" The bridge groaned but held. It was the night the engineers proved that steel alone didn't make a bridge. Men did. March 8th, 1945. The morning after the miracle, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, trembling under the thunder of artillery and the rumble of tank treads. Columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps rolled across its steel frame, their engines echoing like drums of war. The US Army had breached Hitler's last natural barrier, but the bridge was dying. Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, arrived on site before sunrise. His men were exhausted. They'd been building and repairing roads for days without rest. He stared at the twisted skeleton of the bridge and muttered, "If that thing goes down, so do we." Then he gave the order. "We build another one, right next to it." The Rhine River was nearly 400 yards across, swollen with rain and ice. German artillery on the eastern bank zeroed in immediately. Shells screamed overhead, plunging into the mud around the engineers. One burst threw Corporal George Rose off his feet. "They're walking the rounds right up the river," he shouted. Pergrin's answer was calm. "Then we'll just build faster than they can aim." By noon, the 291st had unloaded pontoon sections, steel trusses, and timber decking, pieces of the Bailey Bridge, a British-designed marvel of modular engineering. Each segment could be assembled by hand, locked with pins, and extended like a giant Meccano set. The trick was speed. Under the hiss of incoming fire, teams of 20 worked knee-deep in icy water. They shouted measurements over the noise, hammered pins with frozen hands, and pushed floating sections into place with ropes and poles. Above them, German fighters dove through the clouds, strafing the riverbanks. American anti-aircraft guns answered with a roar. Private Joseph Glasser, crouched behind a pontoon, looked up as tracer rounds cut through the smoke. "You think they'll ever believe this back home?" he asked, voice trembling. Sergeant Harold Klein grinned without looking up. "They will when we drive tanks over it tonight." Across the river, German engineers of the Wehrmacht's Pioneer Battalion 12 watched through field glasses. The Americans had been expected to stall for days. Instead, within hours, steel skeletons began rising from the water like ghosts. A lieutenant turned to his commander, pale. "Herr Major, they are building another bridge." The officer said nothing. He just lowered the binoculars, disbelief etched on his face. By sunset, the first vehicles crept across the new pontoon span, a convoy of trucks loaded with ammunition. The bridge flexed and swayed, but held firm. Cheers erupted from the West Bank. Reporters on scene captured the moment, one writing later, "The Germans destroyed bridges in despair, but the Americans built them in defiance." That night, as shells continued to fall, Pergrin and his men sat in mud beside their creation, a steel path across the Rhine built under fire. One of the sappers, his face black with soot, murmured, "We outbuilt their bombs." For the German engineers who watched helplessly, it was a revelation that shook their faith in victory. The Americans weren't just crossing rivers, they were crossing the limits of what men thought possible. March 9th, 1945. The Rhine Valley burned with the light of 1,000 explosions. The Germans had unleashed everything they had left: mortars, Nebelwerfer rockets, dive bombers, and sabotage squads. Their mission was clear: destroy the bridges at Remagen at any cost. Yet, across the smoke and chaos, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion kept working. Their boots sank into icy mud as they hauled timbers, bolted plates, and repaired damage faster than it appeared. At every whistle of incoming artillery, the men ducked briefly, waited for the blast to pass, then resumed hammering. They had crossed the line between fear and focus. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin stood waist-deep in the river, directing traffic and crews. "Keep 'em moving!" he shouted as trucks creaked over the floating bridge, waves slapping at the pontoons. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. Every hour that the bridge held meant more tanks crossing, more men and machines to pierce the German heartland. On the far side, the 9th Armoured Division dug in, expanding the bridgehead. Flames from burning villages lit the eastern bank. One officer radioed back, "Tell the engineers they're holding up the entire damn war effort, literally." Meanwhile, German High Command panicked. Field Marshal Walter Model, overseeing Army Group B, couldn't believe the reports. "A bridge still stands? Impossible!" he snapped. He ordered the Luftwaffe to obliterate it. Dozens of Focke-Wulf 190s roared over the river, dropping bombs that splashed harmlessly into the current or exploded on empty fields. The bridge, patched and reinforced by hand, refused to die. A war correspondent embedded with the engineers described the scene that night. They worked like ghosts on the water, their faces pale under the moon, their hammers ringing in rhythm with the thunder of guns. I saw men fall, then rise again, carrying the same tools that had just saved them. By March 10th, the Allies had established multiple bridges across the Rhine. Remagen was only the beginning. Bailey bridges sprang up along the river like steel flowers blooming in fire. The Germans, stunned by the speed of reconstruction, found their demolition tactics obsolete. Corporal Glasser, covered in mud, stood beside a completed span and watched another Sherman roll across. "You know," he said, wiping his hands, "I used to think bridges were just things you crossed. Now I think they're the reason we're still alive." The engineers had become soldiers of logistics, warriors of steel and sweat. In just days, they turned Germany's strongest natural defense into a highway of invasion. By mid-March, entire divisions of the US 1st and 9th Armies were pouring across the Rhine. The end was coming fast. and every mile east began with a hammer blow from the men of the 291st. On the night of March 17th, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way, its battered frame collapsing into the Rhine with a massive roar. But by then, it no longer mattered. The Allies had already crossed in force. As dawn broke, Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin stood on the western bank, watching the sun rise over the river his men had conquered. The air smelled of diesel, smoke, and victory. He said quietly to no one in particular, "We didn't build a bridge, we built an ending." Across the water, German engineers stared in silence at what remained, the ruins of their defence, the symbol of their disbelief. They had fought to destroy the future, but the future had already crossed the river.